And I believe we have everyone on the call. Aida, can you make sure you're not muted? I see you just joined.
I'll unmute Aida.
Oh, great.
Oh,
I think Aida I think you both unmuted each other at the same time.
Hear me?
There we go.
Okay.
There we go.
Hola, Aida.
Great.
¿Cómo está, Diana?
Muy bien.
Bien, good. Nice to hear your voice.
Likewise.
So all the panelists are on except I was the last one. So sorry. I thought I was supposed to be on exactly at 2. It looks great, by the way, the PowerPoint. I think this is going to be really exciting.
Great. And I think all of our speakers are on and have good sound quality. It's just now 2 o'clock, so we'll officially get started in 1 more minute. And thanks again to all of you for joining us today for this important conversation.
Thank you.
And Deanna, obviously, I'll turn it over to you in just a minute to get things started off.
Give me the cue, and I will take it away.
And then we should keep this in front of us, the screen that's right here.
Right.
Okay, good.
So.
And you should all be able to look ahead in the PowerPoint so you know where we are.
So if we need to have an offline to you, is there a way for us to chat with you?
Yes. If you look in the lower right, and this is for those who are our attendees on the call as well, in the lower right you'll see a chat screen, and you can chat the host, which is Hispanics in Philanthropy. You can chat all of the panelists, or you can chat a particular panelist or a particular attendee if you want to, in particular, ask a question of clarification or ask a question when we get into the question and answer period of the webinar.
Okay, great.
Do you see where that is, Leslie?
You.
Yes,
yeah,
if you want to chat
camera.
me, you can go to, you click on the triangle there, the inverted triangle, and that gives you the option of chatting me or anyone else directly.
Good. That's great.
That's great. All right.
So how do we know how many attendants, how many participants are on?
Well, so far, you'll see, under attendees, you can see the number. Right now, we have 74 logged in. We have more than 100 registered.
Oh, we have 82.
Wow.
In my screen, it says 82.
Yes,
I think
82.
that's the
That
some
includes
of
the panel.
panelists.
Oh, okay.
So it's a great turnout, and thanks to everyone who's with us. And I think the 2-minute grace period is just about over, so we can get started. Thank you all for joining us for the HIP Philanthropy Lab. This is a Hispanics in Philanthropy series of webinars to create a forum for funders, community leaders, and others to talk about the issues that are most urgently affecting Latino communities, and in particular to talk about what can we as funders do to respond to those issues in the most effective and impactful way possible. And today we're doing, our topic is foundation funding and Latino communities, gaps and opportunities. And I will turn it over to Diana, the President of Hispanics in Philanthropy, to welcome everyone and share some introductory remarks.
Well, thank you, Ben, and thank you to the Foundation Center, to Seema Shah, to Aida Rodriguez, Aaron Dorfman, Cynthia Rivera Weissblum, and Leslie Winner for being on this panel with us. I know that there's been a lot of interest in this report, and we will have ample time to talk about the data collection and the findings, and Seema will do an excellent job of that. I wanted to lead the discussion with a little bit about HIP's reason for doing this report. We felt that it was important to commission an independent source, the Foundation Center, which is, of course, the industry standard, to give us a baseline data that would help us to think about what does change look like, what are best practices, how could we move the needle, and such things. Those of you that read Chronicle of Philanthropy know that last year the Chronicle listed 10 top trends for effective philanthropy in the next decade. One of those trends, not surprisingly, was the growth of the Hispanic population. And when we thought about the time period that we wanted to compile data for through the Foundation Center, we thought about a decade because we wanted to have a sense of how funding was keeping up with population growth, population changes, and so on, and that is the reason why we have a decade's worth of funding. And of course, one of the most intriguing findings in the Foundation Center report is that intentional funding to Latinos has remained about the same, despite a 43% growth in the last decade. The obvious question that comes out of that is why, and what are the levers that help to move change? And we have seen that in the models of best practices, the top 10 foundations that are listed in the report. And we believe that the best way to facilitate movement is, in fact, through good data, through long-term vision, through collaboration, and through commitment. There are many examples of best practices, and I'm happy that Leslie Winner, the director of the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation in North Carolina, is here to talk about one such effort that has taken more than a decade. As Ben said, this is the beginning of a series of conversations and events. The next one will be on April 27th and 28th. We will be hosting a conference in Los Angeles right before the Council on Foundations. And we hope you will join us for that. We do not have, a recipe of what is good and bad. On the contrary, we're really interested in your opinions and ways that we can move forward to make a difference, not only for Latinos, but for everyone. So with that, let me turn it back to my colleague, Ben Maulbeck, who's going to take us through the webinar.
Thank you, Deanna. So just to give you an overview of what we'll be doing today, we'll start off with Seema Shah, the Director of Research and Special Projects for the Foundation Center, who will be presenting the top-level findings of the report to give you a sense of what the data looks like as best as we can tell at this point. Then Dr. Aida Rodriguez, a professor from the Milano School and a former director at the Rockefeller Foundation, will be sharing an analysis of the findings based partly on a recent survey that HIP conducted of both our Latino nonprofit grantees and of our members and funding partners. Then Aaron Dorfman, the Executive Director of the National Committee for Responsible Philanthropy, will build on Aida's analysis with some additional thoughts of his own, particularly based on the work that NCRP is doing identifying effective models for responsive philanthropy in a variety of communities, including Latino communities. And then we'll hear from two foundation CEOs who we feel have started doing the work, have, as Deanna said, begun developing promising practices for the sometimes challenging task of thinking about how to integrate Latino communities fully into a foundation's overall grant-making strategy. And those two panelists will be Leslie Winner, Executive Director of the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation, and Cynthia Rivera Weissblum, President of the Edwin Gould Foundation. And then at the end, we will have time for questions and answers, which you can submit via chat. Feel free to also do that at any time, particularly if you have a point of clarification. And you can do that in the lower right screen, sending them directly to me at Ben Francisco Maulbeck, or directly to one of the panelists if you prefer. And with that, I will turn it over to Seema Shah from the Foundation Center. Thank you, Seema.
Thanks, Ben, and thanks to all of you for joining the webinar today. As Ben mentioned, I'm just going to spend about 15 minutes today walking through the top-level findings of our recently released report, Foundation Funding for Hispanics and Latinos in the United States and for Latin America. The report is the first of its kind and provides an overview of patterns of foundation funding to the Latino community. So before I dive into the findings, I want to give some background on the methodology and how the Foundation Center determines if a grant explicitly benefits Hispanics. So every grant that's in our data set gets coded on a variety of dimensions, including the subject area of the grant, the type of support, so program, operating, capital support, as well as the population group served. Our population group codes include ethnic and racial groups, but they also include nearly 20 other population groups, including children and youth, the economically disadvantaged, women and girls, just to name a few. So how do we determine if a grant is targeting a particular population group? There are two ways that we do that. One is if the recipient organization's mission specifies a population group. So any grant going to HIP, for instance, would automatically get coded as a grant designated to benefit Hispanics because of HIP's mission. The second way we can identify these grants is through their grant description. Historically, we've relied on tax forms for grant descriptions, which tend to offer varying levels of detail. So to address this challenge, a few years ago, we started a program at the Foundation Center called Electronic Grant Reporting, or e-reporting, that allows foundations to give their grants information to us directly, and through that mechanism, we're often able to get more comprehensive data about the designated beneficiaries of grants. So as you can tell, this conservative approach has limitations and often results in undercounting. As we note in the report, we don't suggest that our data represent all giving benefiting Hispanics and Latinos. Rather, our data capture giving that is explicitly designated to benefit Latinos. That said, these are the best available data out there, and it's certainly important to use that data as a starting point for dialogue and for understanding funding patterns. So I do want to note that other studies conducted by the Foundation Center and other organizations have attempted to derive more comprehensive estimates for grant making benefiting communities of color. One approach is to conduct in-depth research on individual grants to figure out if, in fact, a grant might be benefiting Latinos. We've used this methodology for special reports on grant making to communities of color in California and Oregon, and found that many grants, particularly those designated to benefit the economically disadvantaged, which is one of the population groups that we code for, also benefited ethnic and racial minority groups. Now, the challenge with this approach is that it's time-consuming and expensive. As a longer-term solution, we're working with regional associations of grant makers to pilot better and more streamlined ways of collecting diversity data. And as I mentioned earlier, we've been encouraging foundations to submit their grants information to us electronically, which allows for both more timely and detailed data. So with that background, I'm going to go ahead and transition to the research findings. The findings I'm sharing with you today are based on grants data from our annual research set, which consists of grants of $10,000 or more from more than 1,000 large foundations in the United States. This sample typically accounts for half of all U.S. foundation giving domestically and nearly 80% of U.S. foundation giving for international causes. So I'm going to take a few minutes now to walk you through some of the high-level findings, and of course, I'll refer you to the report for additional detail. So first, we found that there has been very little change in foundation funding explicitly designated to benefit Hispanics in the past decade, even as the population of Latinos has grown substantially over that period of time. It's averaged around 1% of grant dollars in the past decade. Again, we're talking only about grants that were specifically designated to benefit Hispanics, which is not the same as all grants that may have benefited Hispanics. One hopeful sign here is that this funding held steady in recent years, even as overall foundation giving declined in the wake of the global recession. Between 2007 and 2009, foundation funding specifically designated to benefit Latinos averaged $206 million a year. When we break that down by subject area, we find that the largest percentage of grant dollars goes to human services, followed closely by health at 26%. In our national analysis of foundation giving trends, Education is generally the highest ranked category. So what's interesting here is that this is a bit of a departure from the patterns we tend to see in overall foundation giving trends. We also slice this data using a social justice lens. Just to clarify, this is the same pool of dollars I talked about in the previous slide, but we're using our methodology for social justice grant making to analyze the data. In our national analysis of social justice grant making, we found that in 2009, 14% of grant dollars were awarded for social justice causes. Among dollars targeting Latinos, this number is quite a bit higher. 38% of grant dollars were for social justice causes. The majority of these grant dollars went to civil rights and civil liberties related issues, as well as healthcare access and affordability. Again, as you can see on this chart, the pattern is somewhat different from national trends. Nationally, we see that the largest proportion of social justice dollars go to economic and community development. We also analyzed regional patterns of giving. And here we found that between 2007 and 2009, the largest chunk of foundation funding targeting Latinos, just under half, went to the West, followed by the South, Northeast, and Midwest. But as you can see on these pie charts, regional funding patterns are generally driven by the largest states in the region and probably the states that you would expect. So for the South, we include DC, but the bulk of funding there is to national organizations. So without DC, about 18% of foundation funding goes to organizations in the South. So another way to look at this data is through per capita funding. This is somewhat of a crude analysis because there are a number of variables we may not be accounting for, but it's interesting and informative nonetheless. So looking at grant dollars per capita, we see that the Northeast leads. The South comes out with the lowest rate of per capita funding. And for those of you interested in your particular state, we have what we call the super table on page 7 of the report that has the state-by-state per capita numbers. HIP has also produced a heat map with this same data, and here you can get sort of a visual map of funding per capita by state. Again, this represents funding explicitly designated to benefit Latinos. So this next table shows funding patterns in the context of population growth and poverty rates. We see that the top 5 fastest growing states are all in the South and have all experienced more than 100% growth in the Hispanic population in the past decade. In addition, these states all rank in the top 10 when it comes to Latino poverty, suggesting that the need for services and resources in the South is particularly high and is also a growing need. In terms of distribution of foundation dollars by metropolitan areas, the Los Angeles metropolitan area receives 17% of all grant dollars directed to Hispanics, followed by the DC area, the New York area, the Bay Area, and the Chicago metropolitan area. By and large, this corresponds with Latino population numbers in these areas. DC is an exception, but ranks in the top 5 because it's a hub for policy organizations and think tanks. With respect to top recipients, La Raza received a total of 36 million grant dollars between 2007 and 2009, accounting for 6% of foundation funding explicitly designated for Latinos. One surprising recipient might be the University of New Mexico Foundation. As you can see, they cracked the top 5 in terms of grant dollars with only 3 grants. But one of those grants was a $10 million grant from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation to create a Center for Health Policy with a focus on Hispanic and Latino populations. So now I'm going to shift gears and talk about U.S. foundation funding that is directed toward Latin American countries. When I talk about international funding, it actually includes 2 distinct streams of funding. One is funding to U.S.-based international programs. So those are organizations and programs based in the U.S., but with programs focused on Latin America. And the second stream of funding is cross-border giving, which is giving to organizations located in Latin America. In the interest of time, I'm going to talk about international giving in its totality, but if you're interested in specific breakdowns, they are available in the report. So overall, Latin America received 5% of U.S. international funding, but we also have codes in our data for developing countries and global programs, which, as you can see from this pie chart, received the largest chunk of grant dollars. And we suspect that a good number of those grant dollars benefit Latin America as well. An average of $350 million a year was directed to Latin American countries from 2007 to 2009. In terms of country by country breakdowns, Mexico and Brazil led in terms of grant dollars. The largest percentage of funding for Latin America in terms of subject area went to the environment and animals, largely due to grants that were made to organizations like Conservation International, the World Wildlife Fund, and the Wildlife Conservation Society. And finally, we have the top funders list for Latin America, which is led by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Their funding accounted for nearly a quarter of U.S. foundation giving to Latin America. And then finally, I want to draw your attention to the fact that we have a special section on Puerto Rico in the report. There are a fairly small number of foundations that give to Puerto Rico. The top 10 U.S. foundations accounted for 65% of giving to Puerto Rico. And interestingly, 6 of the top 10 foundations that gave to Puerto Rico were corporate foundations, led by Johnson & Johnson in the #1 spot. We also provide some data in the section about giving by foundations located in Puerto Rico, which are actually not included in our research sample. And so here it's important to note that Puerto Rican-based foundations are making substantial philanthropic contributions. For example, the Angel Ramos Foundation gave more than $9 million grant dollars between 2007 and 2009, which is about 9 times the giving that Johnson & Johnson did during that same time period. So I'm going to stop there and turn it back over to Ben to introduce the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Seema, and thanks for that that clear and thoughtful presentation of the data. So Seema has given us a great overview of some of the numbers and what they look like. And as she said, you know, there are a lot of caveats behind the numbers in terms of we're not capturing all of the grants benefiting Latino communities. But regardless of, you know, whether it's 1% or 5% or 10%, you know, our sense from this preliminary data is that it is less than it would be in an ideal world, especially given that the Latino population is growing rapidly and is now 16% of the country. So with that in our minds, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Aida Rodriguez to start looking at the why. You know, why is it that foundations are underfunded, which we tend to underfund Latino communities, which we hope can lead us into a good conversation about what we can do about it collectively. Aida?
Hi. Hi, everyone. This is Aida. I want to start by saying that, first of all, I've been in the foundation community literally for 35 years, and I now sit on the board of the New York Foundation. So I've always, you know, felt that I understood the trends and was part of what was happening in the foundation community. And I have to say, when I see that line in one of the early Seema charts where it's just flat, the giving for Latino communities, it's almost a statistical impossibility. And you look at that line and you go, what is that, the hand of God? It's just amazing. So you really want to start asking very deep questions about what are the causes of this underfunding. And I think Seema did a good job trying to explain how you get the data and that there isn't as much distortion in what we have as people suspect. What we did to get information for this, and we had a short period of time, but we thought it best to interview or to get information from both the funders in the HIP network as well as those grantees who have received support from Hispanics in philanthropy. So what we sent out was, through SurveyMonkey, really a census to all the foundations who are members and supporters of Hispanics in philanthropy, as well as to all, and I think it was a total of close to 400 HIP grantees. We sent it out to 176 funders. We received a total of 60 responses, which was a response rate of 34%, and the response rate for the grantee survey was 39%. We had 155 respondents. I don't have to say it, but clearly this is a biased sample. We don't have a representation of foundations in general, but we wanted to know is what are the beliefs and perceptions of those funders that we know are committed to the Latino community. Because when you see a flat line like that, you want to start by understanding the friends of the community. What do they think is important? What do the grantees think is important? And is there a discrepancy in the funding even among the friends of Latino communities? So that's the sample we have. And as I said, it was SurveyMonkey, and people completed the surveys. What did we find? Let me say a little bit about the composition of the funder profile, and I think the slides are ahead of me, but you could see, first of all, they're in senior positions, the funders. They've been with the organization over 11 years, and they come from traditional foundations, primarily private foundations and community foundations. So what you're looking at is a funder profile of what you think of when you think of funders who've been in the field a long time, can make decisions, and are working with institutions we're familiar with. The disbursement across the country is not even. We have more in California, North Carolina, and New York, but you have representatives from different parts of the country in the sample. Now the grantee survey respondents, and I think this will go long. Oh, the positions. As I stated earlier, you have program officers, program directors, CEO, and others. These are people who could make decisions, should be able to impact the grant-making agenda of an institution. Let me turn quickly to the composition of the grantee sample. You have primarily people who've been in the field, in their organization a long time, an average of 11 years, if not more. They're senior, they're experienced, and they're working in organizations, as you can see, that are actually multi-focused, various primary areas of servicing. There we are. Advocacy, multi-services, the largest group, education. So it's a lot of diversity in what the programs focus on. Let's go on to the next profile. Position titles, as I was saying, these are senior people. For the most part, we were looking for executive directors. And by the way, we were careful to select one person, both for the foundations and the executive directors, to answer the survey, so we don't have 2 and 3 representatives from one foundation, for example, or 2 or 3 representatives from grantees. These people represent individual institutions. So what you have here are pretty much the senior people, the ones who are making decisions in both samples, and these are grantee organizations that primarily serve Latinos. So what did we find? What we were looking for first is what were the priorities as identified by funders and Latino nonprofits. What do they think was important? And if we look first at the funders, education was the first priority. This is what they thought Latino communities needed, what they thought the communities were most concerned with. The second is economic development, and then immigration. The economic development here includes those who thought that economic justice was a primary issue in the community. If you take out economic justice, economic development actually does not fall in one of the top 3 for funders. Now, looking at the red bar, Latino nonprofits, education, economic development, and immigration. Well, there is, and if you go to the next, social justice, if you look, of course, there really is some compatibility in what funders and Latino nonprofits consider to be the main policy issues. When I think back to what Seema presented, she said the major funding goes to, and she listed first, I think it began with human services, health, public affairs, education, and the arts. So already, here you're looking at what are the community priorities as indicated by HIP funders and HIP nonprofits. And it's different from where the giving is going according to Seema statistics. Again, they said human services, health, education, the arts. You already begin to see a difference between Latinos and others. Now, if we move forward, grant-making focuses of respondents compared to top priorities identified for Latino communities. The blue bar is the grant-making focus. That was one of the key funding areas for for funders, children and youth, followed by education, health, which was not a priority on the previous chart. So they're giving to an area that they didn't consider a priority, the same with children and youth. If you keep going further down, economic development was a priority for both and luckily shows up as a top priority for funding. And so on. Immigration is at the very end, where if you look at the earlier charts, it was at the beginning. So there's an inconsistency. Again, you have grantees and funders who almost have the same sets of priorities, but when you look at the grant making in the community, the funders to the grantees, it's inconsistent. This is not what they're funding, what they believe is important. And you have to ask yourself, and let me say one more thing before I go on to why this is the case, because this is a key finding. One of the questions we ask the Latino nonprofits is, where do they feel they need grant money? And it's what you expect. There's a great need for capacity building grants to fund the back of the house, as they say, the back half, administration, accounting, and a real need for organizational sustainability, capacity building support, the things that strengthen these organizations. Now, we asked an open-ended question on unmet needs and obstacles. What is it they're not getting, Latino nonprofits? And this wordle, you see communities, development, education, Latino funding. There's no surprises here. Clearly, what we're hearing from the communities is what you expect to hear from what are many emerging nonprofit organizations, and organizations that, if you think back to that flat line, are not getting support. And I want to step back a minute and say, I have a theory, and a lot of people, and you should have a theory of change. How do you see things going along, and why are you funding one thing and not another? And when I think, when people see a problem and they are really feeling a problem, they begin to talk to others. You begin to see, especially as you saw with the demonstrations last year, there is an organizing, a loose organizing, that then becomes non-registered organizations, where you see in the Latino community a lot of not registered nonprofits. It goes from there to 501c3s, which are the primarily grantee sample we have here. They then begin to form umbrella organizations, and then you begin to see increasingly strong advocacy for policy change, new legislation, and the like. So this cycle, which we see, and because we have a relatively new immigrant population, a very large immigrant population among Latinos, you really have a lot of the first stages, people organizing, non-registered groups, increasingly emerging 501c3s. These are the very organizations that need the kind of capacity building and sustainability grants, organizational general support grants that are not being given. And then on top of that, you look at what the funders are funding, and it's not even consistent with their own wishes, let alone that of the Latino communities. You can see where there's a problem. Now, why? Why is there this inconsistency? I only have a few minutes, so I'll go through this quickly. One response from the grantees is that there is literally a lack of funding. More than half of the respondents said when it came time to make a decision on a Latino community grant or a Latino organization proposal, they did not have sufficient funds. Surprising, these are people, remember, as I said, in pretty large institutions or at least stable private and community foundations. That quickly translates, and others, about 1/3 of them said, that really there's just different priorities. Their institution and the program they're in just does not prioritize Latino community needs. And the other, which surprised me, remember this is a network of people who understand the Latino community, one of the perspectives is that there really is a lack of strong Latino nonprofits that they feel they could fund that would fulfill their grant-making mission. So they feel it's a challenge. And it's interesting because that, of course, relates directly to what I was saying earlier, that there are emerging Latino organizations that need capacity building and general support to meet the standard of expectations that you hear from large and even small traditional foundations. The capacity of Latino organizations, many of them operate with less than $100,000 if we're lucky annual budget. So the recommendations: increase the diversity of leadership in philanthropy, especially at the executive and trustee levels. Yes, what we have here are the executives, and they see an inconsistency. But when you look at them saying that the mission of their foundation is different or that they lack funds, you know that trustees of these institutions and the other senior managers may not understand Latino communities. Second, develop institutional policies and strategies for equity and inclusiveness of Latinos and in underserved communities. Again, you have to begin to bring the people that are in the nonprofit level into the conversation, be able to influence not just what they think are the priorities, but what are the needs, and more importantly, what is the role that Latino nonprofits play in a social justice movement. The indications from many studies that have been done in the nonprofit sector, which is the sector I operate in, have shown that nonprofits are a very important part of making change historically and now in this country. It is not only that you have organizations that serve Latinos, Latino nonprofits actually create Latino leadership. And that Latino leadership not only impacts through the organization, but impacts through many other things, many other ways. So you have to consider that when you're funding a Latino nonprofit, you're not just funding the services they provide, you're actually developing a base Latino leadership. So it's an important distinction that is not often clear. When I think of the New York Foundation, one of the first organizations they funded 100 years ago was the NAACP. That was a tiny organization. They didn't think they were taking a risk, and they were right 100 years later. So the question is, why do we continue to think of small nonprofits as risky investments when the evidence suggests the opposite? I don't want to go on. I think I've taken up my time. I have a longer list of recommendations for HIP, but I could do that in response to your questions. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you, Aida. Yep, we're here. Can you hear me?
Yep. I think I did my 15 minutes. Is that good?
Absolutely. That was perfect. I think that was a great starting point for a conversation about, what are the causes and factors that cause this disconnect at a macro level, despite the fact of so much alignment, which I think is one of the most interesting findings, is that the HIP network had such commonality in terms of what they saw as priorities for Latino communities. So now I'm going to turn it over to Aaron Dorfman, who is the Executive Director of the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy, probably Responsible Philanthropy too, who will share some of his analysis drawing on some of the recent research and work that NCRP has been doing. Thanks for being with us, Aaron.
Great to be with you. Thanks, Ben. Thanks to Deanna and Hispanics in Philanthropy for pulling this together. It's an important topic. Can you advance 2 slides for me? Thanks. There we go. So some of you may or may not be familiar with the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy, so I'll just give a bit of brief background. For the past 35 years, NCRP has been the nation's only independent watchdog organization for philanthropy, and we promote philanthropy that serves the public good, is responsive to people and communities with the least wealth, opportunity, and power, and is held accountable to the highest standards of integrity and openness. And, a mediocre politician might get voted out of office, and a mediocre corporation might go out of business. But a mediocre endowed foundation can go on and on for decades being mediocre. And so NCRP holds up a mirror for foundations and challenges them to do more to strengthen communities. Next slide. So the report, as Seema described so well, highlights many of the disparities faced by Latino communities when it comes to giving by America's grant-making institutions. And the data are disturbing, to be sure, but they're not new. And even though I knew the numbers were going to be bad, I was frankly outraged when I saw how little change there's been in the past decade. That flat line that Aida was talking about certainly struck me in the gut, and I was a little shocked and outraged. And I'm sure many people on the call today share that anger. And so I want to outline some ideas in my few minutes here about things that we can do about the problem and an opportunity to really funnel the anger into hopefully productive and positive change. Next slide. So before I get into steps we can take, I need to offer a little more background. In 2009, NCRP released its criteria for philanthropy at its best, urging foundations to meet 4 criteria and 10 benchmarks. And the first 2 benchmarks, which comprise our values criterion, and which you see on the slide there, suggest that grant makers invest at least half their grant dollars for the intended benefit of communities that have been underserved or marginalized in some way, and at least a quarter of their grant dollars for strategies like advocacy, community organizing, civic engagement, and other approaches that promote long-term systemic change. And when we were designing our benchmark, especially that first one, we intentionally lumped together many different underserved or marginalized communities in creating that standard so that we would avoid some of the data pitfalls that sometimes come up in these kinds of situations. So we didn't, for example, want to pit funding that benefits Latinos against funding for the elderly or for the economically disadvantaged. And by including 13 different underserved or marginalized groups in one data metric there, it tends to capture more of the grants. You'll hear when people are being defensive about how much foundation funding benefits Latinos, they'll say that certain grants are coded to benefit economically disadvantaged communities, for example, are certainly benefiting Latinos, but they aren't getting counted that way. So by putting some of the metrics together, we were hoping to avoid the undercounting pitfalls. Still, we found that only 1 out of every $3 given by American foundations is said to be or is intended to benefit an underserved community, even when you define it that broadly. So we still have a systemic issue in American philanthropy. Next slide, please. So one series of reports we've been doing since we released criteria for philanthropy at its best is our high impact strategies for philanthropy series. And these reports really make a case for why funders concerned about particular issues like education, health, or the arts or the environment, why they might want to live up to the benchmarks suggested in the criteria, why that might lead to higher impact giving. And each report tracks how foundations, regardless of what issues they want to fund, can use these high impact strategies to benefit underserved communities. And, some might say it doesn't matter if you intentionally target or seek to benefit Latino communities or any other underserved community. But I think what we've observed, and the principle I want to talk about for a moment here, is that of targeted universalism. And it's it's an academic term, but the idea is that if you seek to intentionally benefit the most underserved or vulnerable communities that you're hoping to benefit, your intervention will benefit that community and also have benefits for others in the community. Whereas the reverse isn't actually true. If you design your philanthropy, if you design your programs hoping to benefit everyone in your community, some folks are going to get left out. We've all seen this over the years, and certainly Programs designed to benefit everyone sometimes do benefit everyone, but often they end up leaving some people behind. And so by being more intentional about who philanthropy is seeking to benefit, we can really ensure we have greater impact. Next slide. The other series of reports we've been doing that may have may be helpful in this discussion is our Grantmaking for Community Impact project. It's a series of 7 place-based reports documenting the benefits of foundation funding for advocacy and community organizing. In each report, we studied 10 to 20 nonprofits. Next slide, please. And sought to understand the benefits of their policy wins over the previous 5-year period. So in the aggregate, across the 7 sites, we found $26.6 billion in benefits to families, communities, and taxpayers, and off of total spending of only $231 million. And so the return on investment from that is an astounding 115 to 1. Next slide, please. All of the research reports show how funding in these ways can benefit Latino communities and also all Americans. Just to give you some examples of some of the highest monetizable impacts that we were able to document in the reports included efforts to raise the minimum wage, institute cost-saving reforms in state budgets, spurring affordable housing development through housing trust funds, increasing education funding for low-income schools, and from community benefits agreements that tie for-profit development to neighborhood improvements and jobs, those kinds of activities. One example from our North Carolina report, we note how the Farm Worker Advocacy Network, which was a partnership of El Pueblo, Inc., the North Carolina Latino Coalition, and 13 other nonprofits, how they successfully collaborated to amend the North Carolina Migrant Housing Act, which improved inspection practices of North Carolina Department of Labor and required farmers to provide clean, sanitary living conditions. And this was a win that produced about $500,000 in benefits for an estimated 100,000 migrant farm workers, many of them Latinos. And it also secured an additional $124,000 in annual recurring funding for 2 new migrant housing inspectors. So those are the kinds of campaigns we've been able to document how they benefit families and communities. Next slide. Yep. Of course, many of the policy wins that we were able to document through the Grantmaking for Community Impact project could not be quantified monetarily, but were just as important, if not more so, for the people who benefit. And our reports documented campaigns that expanded or protected the rights of immigrants, protected the quality of our air and water, especially in communities of color, and expanded access to health care and services for underserved non-white populations. And if we could have placed a monetary value on all of the policy wins that we were able to document, the return on investment would have been even substantially higher than the 115 to 1. So a final project I want to share before I get into the specific steps you can take is that NCRP is now inviting grant makers to sign on to Philanthropy's Promise. This is an initiative that celebrates grant makers who have pledged to meet those 2 benchmarks from the values criterion. And I'm really happy to report that Hispanics in Philanthropy, because of its role as a grant maker, has signed on, and many of the HIP members are among the 104 foundations who have signed on already. And there you see on the screen some of the HIP members who have signed on for Philanthropy's Promise. So what can we do? I don't claim to have all the answers on this, and lots of great people have been working hard, and we see the needle isn't really moving very much. So I don't know that these things will work, but I do know that it's going to take each one of us who's on this call and wants to see things improve, really taking it upon ourselves to, influence those that you can influence. So certainly one step is sharing the research, share the data. Some people do respond to data, and if showing folks that funding grassroots organizing for civil and human rights produces a bang for the buck, a return on investment, if that's helpful, please use the reports and share the research. If you're a funder who cares about health or education issues and our reports on those subjects are helpful as you try to sway others to intentionally prioritize more funding to benefit Latino communities, by all means use the reports and share the research. If we aren't the ones continually raising the questions in our own institutions, who's going to do it? And that's certainly how I've seen things. When things do change, that's how they change. Someone refuses to let go of the issue and really keeps bringing it back again and again. You can share the research. You can start a dialogue in your own foundation. You can invite your foundation to sign on to Philanthropy's Promise and make a pledge, make it explicit. We'd be delighted to have others, and I can talk with folks offline to provide you with more resources on that. But that's really how I see change happening. I know there are some efforts to mandate or legislate better performance from our sector on this. I'm not a big fan of those because I think some of the where we would eventually end up is with mandates that philanthropy replace government funding that has been cut, which is not a place that I'm excited to go. But
Great.
I think with that, I'll wrap it up and turn it back over to Ben. I'm looking forward to a good, robust dialogue today.
Great. Thanks, Aaron. Great to hear all the ways that NCRP's work is very much dovetailing with HIP's work, I think. So with that, now that we've looked at the numbers and sort of started thinking about the why of the numbers, we'd like to move into, as Aaron just started us doing, sort of what can we do? What are some successful strategies? And we're starting that discussion with Leslie Winner, who's the Executive Director of the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation. Some of you may have noticed when the heat map came up earlier while Seema was presented, North Carolina was quite a bit darker than most of the states in its vicinity. On average, states in the Southeast received about $5 per Latino in funding from foundations, whereas North Carolina received more than $13 per Latino in funding. And I think much of that is actually due to the leadership of the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation and other foundations in North Carolina who have really come together and talked collectively and proactively about what can we do to respond to Latino communities, to our growing Latino communities, and to be effective in serving them as part of our grant making. So Lacey, I'd like to turn it over to you and ask what, during this process of Z. Smith Reynolds' work and working with other funders and with HIP, what have you found has worked well? What have been the successes and what have been the challenges, and any lessons learned that you found along the way?
Thank you, Ben. Just as a matter of introduction, the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation is a 75-year-old foundation that was created to improve the lives of the people of North Carolina. So we're restricted in our funding to North Carolina, but have quite a broad mandate within the state. And one of our primary focus areas is to promote non-discriminatory just communities. So as I'm sure you're probably aware, the Latino population has had a dramatic demographic shift in North Carolina in the past 10 years. Between 2000 and 2010, it increased 111%, putting us 6 behind those 5 that were on the slide before. And now the Latino community is about 10% of the population of the state. So that community is definitely.
Leslie, can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay. Can all the other panelists hear?
Yes.
I've received a few complaints via chat that the audio is not working.
I can hear.
I can hear.
So maybe I need to speak up and slow down.
I think it's fine. Let me check with those. Okay. It seems like it's fine, so maybe it was a momentary glitch. Thanks, Leslie. I'm sorry, and keep going.
No problem. So the Latino community is definitely one of the targets of our work in this area of promoting non-discriminatory, just communities. And over the last 10 years, we've invested about $12 million in organizations that impact the Latino community or are Latino-run organizations. So we think about this investment in the Latino community in three primary ways. One is that we do make direct investments in community-based Latino organizations throughout North Carolina, some of them very, very tiny with just one employee, some of them very sophisticated like the Latin American Coalition in Charlotte. We also invest in organizations that serve the Latino community, such as the North Carolina Justice Center and other legal services organizations that provide legal assistance to documented and undocumented immigrants. And we fund organizations like Student Action for Farm Workers that does grassroots organizing, in this case in the Latino farm worker community. But the third way that we invest in the Latino communities in North Carolina is through HIP, which Reynolds has done since 2001, and it is definitely our best leverage for our money. The way that the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation and the North Carolina HIP Funders Collaborative works is that the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation makes a grant to HIP that is what I call a one-to-one-to-one matching grant. So we give $1 for every dollar that another North Carolina foundation gives into this funding collaborative, and then National HIP matches those dollars as well with $1. So when a foundation gives a dollar, they get a Z. Smith Reynolds dollar and a HIP dollar. And one of the advantages of that is that because we then make these funding decisions collaboratively, it enables small foundations or even medium-sized foundations to make a relatively small investment in a way that has impact. And we have really targeted that HIP funding mostly on capacity building in Latino-led organizations and on leadership development for the boards and staff of these Latino-led organizations. So both at Z. Smith Reynolds and in the North Carolina HIP Collaborative, we think of this work in a continuum. The first is investing in organizations that are meeting the basic needs of the Latino community and doing maybe some basic local advocacy to provide access to local services. The second is to build financial stability and to develop the leadership of the boards and CEOs of these Latino-led organizations. And the third is to invest in the advocacy capacity and empowerment of the Latino community. So you have to start where you are. You can't, we would all like to start at level number 3 by investing in advocacy capacity and empowerment, but that's not where we are in every community. So we try to take these communities where we are and invest in them in a way that moves them along this continuum, first to helping them just meet local needs in a way that promotes their financial stability as an organization, and then investing in their leadership, and finally trying to help them move into advocacy and empowerment. That's really our priority as a foundation, is really to help organizations move from this lowest level up the effectiveness ladder. And I think that's the priority of the North Carolina HIP Collaborative. And then we're also committed to helping sustain them when they are moved up the ladder, but what we find is that then they are less and less dependent on us to sustain them financially. And I'll be happy to answer any questions, or Ben, I don't know how you want to handle that.
No, that's great. We will. We have. Thank you for those thoughts, Leslie. And we are going to have. We have one more panelist also sharing experiences in grant making for Latino communities. Cynthia Rivera Weissblum, who is the president and CEO of the Edwin Gould Foundation, which has a very precise focus on a specific strategy that I'm sure Cindy will talk about in terms of education, but also focusing on improving academic achievement among sort of middle-level students, which are often neglected. And I'll let Cindy talk about that. But part of why we hope to hear from Cindy is one of the challenges that came up in the survey, as Aida mentioned, is that many foundations struggle because there's a desire to provide more grants to Latino communities, but it may be difficult if you have a very narrow program priority, mandate, or grant-making strategy to find organizations that even fit within those priorities and are Latino-focused and Latino-serving. So Cindy, as with Leslie, we'd love to thank you for being here, and we'd love to hear you talk about some of the strategies you've looked at and the lessons learned that you found along the way.
Thanks, Ben, and thanks for having me join. I've already learned and sort of connected to some great points already that have been made by my colleagues. I think when Aida mentioned the fact that nonprofits are the catalyst, are the incubation for Latino leadership, you forget that. And thank you for reminding us about that. And that's a very important for our nation when we need that vibrant leadership, and we need to look ahead at what the future is going to bring. And also, Adam, I really appreciate your kind of focusing on keeping our feet to the fire. And I think it's a constant reminder of the work. And when I came to the Gould Foundation in 2007, I very much thought about something that Leslie said, which was start where you are. And I had a great board, but this foundation was making small grants to lots of different kinds of organizations and really wasn't focusing on where its strengths lied. And so one of the first things that happened when I came to the foundation is to help the board think about where their strength was. And their strength was clearly in college completion for low-income youth. And so our foundation solely focuses on college completion for low-income youth. And Latinos are explicit in that narrative. And one of the reasons that's very clear to us, and as we work in the advocacy part of our work, Latinos are explicit in our narrative because America cannot improve its college degree attainment rate without a concentrated and deliberate focus on Latino college completion. And there's a little-known statistic that is quite dramatic and basically outlines how Latinos are the driving force in educational advancement to the entire nation. And let me take a minute to explain it. In the 10 years between 2005 and 2015, there will be 200,000 fewer white high school graduates. And there will be 200,000 more Latino high school graduates. And so this 400,000 swing will have a very broad impact. Because if you apply the current differences in graduation rates by race and ethnicity, and those graduation rates persist, it will be highly unlikely that America will advance towards its goal of improving college completion. So unless we focus on Latinos, we really can't propel America ahead. And so that's a very deliberate message in our advocacy work. And so what kind of rub does that hit up against? I think that in regard to the broader landscape and the growing gap between the rich and the poor, we all know that America is skewing poor. The number of poor children that are going to be attending public schools by 2020 is expected to double. I think in New York, because of our demographic, low income is used as a proxy for Latinos. But we know that Latinos are a majority of that low income population. However, being intentional about serving Latinos is one of the most impactful strategies we can have in grant making, especially in regard to college completion. College going within the Latino community involves a really deep understanding and a culturally specific thinking about interventions. For example, in New York, for example, the issue of the family wage. A recent study by the Community Service Society showed that young Mexican men between the ages of 16 and 24, 68% of them are not in school and employed. And overall, 55% of Latino males aged 16 to 24 years old are in school as well as employed. So the issue of family wage has a significant impact and is a critical factor as families consider college going. And this is just one example of the specifics, the culturally specific thinking and interventions that need to be addressed as you think about Latino college completion. So for Gould, we are faced with a demand, an increased demand for services for the population that is now skewing poor. And the dialogue that's happening in America about educational outcomes are now being couched not as the race and ethnic gap, but the income-based gap. And that is going to require us to even be more deliberate in promoting Latinos in the college completion agenda. So I don't think it's going to be easy. I think we're going to have to be more deliberate and more focused and have more ability to inform and advocate. Many of you may have read the article in the New York Times this week about the book that was recently issued by the Russell Sage and the Spencer Foundation. It's called Wither Opportunity. I suggest it's quite a long book, but I suggest it because it does outline that shift that's happening in the national dialogue about the income-based gap in education. And I'd be happy to take questions and include some of my thoughts in the dialogue that we're going to have.
Great. Thank you so much, Cindy. And thank you to all of our panelists for being part of this important conversation. We have about 25 minutes left for question and answer. And just a reminder that you can submit questions in the lower right where it says Q&A, and you can send that directly to me or one of the panelists per your preference. Probably easier to send it to me since I'm going to be doing traffic control, or to all panelists. And we'll try to get as many of the questions answered as possible, that we already have quite a few, and thanks to those of you who have already submitted questions. So my first question that we're hearing is for Seema, and it is about the data collection, and particularly data collection in reference to universities. So one attendee has asked, are you including the amount of money received by universities working on or with Latinos? And another respondent had asked, in particular, I think they saw that UC, the University of California system, was on the list of top 10 grantees, and wondered what that was for in terms of the specific grants. Seema, could you give us I think this is a great way to give us a window into the details of the data and how it shook out. Could you shed some light on it for us?
Sure, thanks for the question. So our grants data would include foundation grants awarded to universities. It doesn't include any government funding or private donors that are giving to universities, and we know, from research on broader philanthropic giving trends that that's where the largest chunk of money is probably coming from anyway. But our data set does account for foundations that are awarding grants to universities. And as you saw in that top recipient chart, University of California campuses ranked third in terms of recipients, and that actually includes all campuses, not just a single campus, so that was system-wide. And I don't have in front of me, exactly what those grants were for. I can provide that specific information if somebody wants to contact me offline. But in general, those grants are going for research purposes, they're going for programs that might be targeting Latinos, and in some cases, scholarship programs as well.
Sorry, so the data on universities are included if you're able to identify that the grant is for a program that specifically targets Latinos, either with research or outreach or leadership development or something like
right.
that. Does it also?
It would be the same criteria that we would use to, look at all of any other grant.
There are also some universities that are called Hispanic serving institutions that that largely serve Hispanics, where it's the vast majority. Particularly in places like South Florida and the Southwest and other areas where there's a large number of Latinos. Are you able to capture those, Seema?
Yeah,
or are those
so
mostly not captured?
That would go back to the criteria that we use. So if it's part of the university's mission and it's clear from their documentation or their website that that's a part of their mission, those grants would automatically be coded as being explicitly designated for Latinos because of the particular mission of the university.
Okay, great. That's a helpful clarification. So another question we have coming in, and I think this is for all of the panelists. This is from Rudolph Gonzalez. Latinos have lost 66% of their wealth last year. And with this major loss in wealth and the high numbers of unemployment and underemployment we're seeing among Latinos, shouldn't human services also be a priority for Latino communities? And I think that is interesting because one thing we did hear in the survey that Aida conducted, particularly from the grantee respondents, was that there was a real need in terms of basic needs in human services that they didn't feel was fully being met, particularly given cuts in state government funding, which many service organizations have been reliant upon. And I think that's an issue not just for Latino communities, but actually for many communities. So would any of the panelists like to take a stab at that?
So this is Leslie. I can say that from our perspective, of course the Latino communities have to be concerned about the provision of human services. I don't think philanthropies can make up for the loss of government funding or really for the lack of access of the Latino communities to basic human services, and we just don't have enough money to do that. And so it seems to me that the goal has to be to assure that the Latino community has fair access to the human services that their communities provide, and that is going to end up being done through advocacy. So if there's a human service offered in their community or in their city or state or whoever is doing the offering in their locality, the goal has to be to do enough advocacy to make sure that the Latino community has realistic access to it.
Ben, let me just add that I didn't see human services a priority in our grantee and funder service, but Seema had it as one of the areas where there's substantial giving. It was human services. I think what you see is when people talk about children and youth, I think it's a reflection of their concern about human services. So the priority on children and youth, I think, is a concern about human services. But I agree that, foundations are not going to substitute for the need for government grants and the delay in paying nonprofits.
Absolutely.
Government at all levels are holding grantees up to 6 and 7 months, just waiting for payments on services already completed. And I think foundations do have a role in making that information much more public.
I know many nonprofits that have had to take loans when they could find it to cover what the government owes them. And I think a lot more should be said about that and should be made public. And I do think the foundations have a role to play in that because, you know, it may be that the money's there because the contracts were written or it may have been diverted. But I think, you know, the person who asked the question is correct. There is a demand, and I think you see it in the children and youth priority. And I think there are a lot of practices, government practices, that have to be really made public and advocated against.
Mm-hmm. This is Deanna. I wanted to agree with you, Aida, and also underscore a point that Leslie made, that is that foundations cannot take the role of municipal, state, or federal government.
Absolutely.
I mean, the size of, for example, the state of California, which is the 8th largest economy in the world, cannot, you know, be substituted by a few well-intentioned private foundations and corporations. So it's important that we understand how foundations, you know, can work in concert with perhaps government, but not as a substitute for. And I think in lean times like this, you know, there's a lot of controversy about items like that. And frankly, in one person's opinion, government has not done a particularly good job by Latinos. So I know that there are, as Aaron mentioned, there are those that are thinking that legislation, you know, or some regulation over foundations might be worthwhile, but I don't believe that that is a good recourse. On the contrary, I think, you know, that's governments have not done well by us, and yet I think the record shows that some foundations and their best practices are a more promising course of action.
Absolutely, and there's such a difference in scale too. What is annual foundation giving in total, Seema? It's $30 billion or something like that.
35 billion.
35 billion. So that's
45?
that's a tiny fraction of total government spending. It could never possibly be a substitute, even if it wanted to be.
But I want to emphasize that it does have a lot more power, the philanthropic community, than it uses in advocating for changing government. I think they're way too averse to risk and in taking a position, and it's unnecessary. They really can take positions and actually still be careful of the lobbying restrictions. And there's just a risk averseness in this sector as a whole.
Absolutely. So I'm getting another question that's, we're not going to get through all the questions, unfortunately, but this is one that I think is emblematic of a few of the questions we're getting. I'd like to find out how funds are being perceived that relate directly to treating the mental health of Latinos, particularly the mental health of the undocumented, and the serious symptoms of trauma that they experience. And particularly, this person is wondering, and this is from Belinda Arriaga, you know, what about the difference in strategies between funding nonprofits, and I presume Latino nonprofits in particular, to provide those sorts of services, and more mainstream health institutions? And I think that we're getting a few questions sort of in reference to that sort of issue of what about, you know, where do all of you see the challenges or the different possibilities of strategies that are focused on serving Latinos through mainstream larger organizations that will serve a certain percentage of Latinos versus through Latino-focused and Latino-led nonprofit organizations? And is there, you know, is there one strategy that could work better than the other, or is one, you know, is there a way they can work in tandem? What do all of you think?
I don't know. I don't know a lot about the funding in the health community, so I can't answer.
Let me ask Cindy, you've sort of done, it seems like a dual strategy where certainly much of your funding goes to large institutions that serve Latino communities and many other communities, and then you've also funded some groups that really focus on Latino populations. Have you found that those can work together, and have you had any success in facilitating collaboration between the two? What have you seen in your experience?
Sure, I can't comment on mental health, healthcare issues, but I can focus on education.
Of course.
And one of the things that we do have here in Gould is that we have about 5 organizations at a time that live with us. And all of the organizations focus on college completion. And our intention was to kind of lower the size. If everybody lives in the same house, that people will communicate with one another, and so that has happened. I also, since we bring the grantees together often, and we're all focused on college completion, there also has been sort of best strategy sharing. So we invested in an English language arts curriculum that is delivered on Saturdays, and one of the other organizations borrowed some of the strategies from the organization that is using the English language arts curriculum. So our focus is, much of our energies when I first came on board for the first few years, was spent on building the academic products that can deliver a competitive critical thinking and critical writing curriculum, and those kind of things are made to be shared. And so I think that the living together strategy works, but also being we're so focused on the same area, there's that cross-pollination that happens as well.
So this is
I'm sorry, I just want to say that this is not a push where you push these ideas onto organizations. It's more of a draw or a pull, that if you put the strategies out there, organizations want them. So it's the pull versus the push.
What I was going to say, this is Leslie, we don't fund health or mental health services, but I happen to be on the board of an organization that provides mental health services to Latino populations, and the need for it is driven by the fact that there are so very few mental health professionals that are trained to provide mental health services to Latino populations, especially immigrants, in a way that's culturally competent. So I think that all speaks for funding this specialization, but the other side of it is that this organization and no nonprofit can really meet the quantity of the need without either having government partners or having government contracts. So as with many other areas of need, there's definitely a role for the nonprofit community, but it's unlikely that the nonprofit community can get all the way there to meeting the need by itself. I don't know if that was helpful.
No, yeah, definitely.
I hope down the line. I just wanted to say that that question is so important that maybe at some point we could have a webinar just around the mental health issue.
Absolutely.
I have to say the underfunding of mental health in this country as a whole and the denial we live in is really hurting, and the fact that Latinos, without the insurance, without the ability to pay for these doctors, it's going to be, the impact is so tremendous in our communities. So I hope you put it on the list of possible areas to return to.
Absolutely. We're getting some questions about trustees and CEOs, and in particular diversity of trustees and foundation staff. There was in D5's recent report on the state of the work, there were some numbers on those which showed that Latinos and underserved groups were underrepresented in foundations, particularly at the executive and trustee levels, less so at the program staff levels, which is a nice that we're seeing some progress there. But Aida in particular, I'm wondering, or anyone else, are you seeing in the data, a question we've gotten from a couple people, are we seeing in the data any correlation where if the staffing or the board is more diverse, then that then seems to lead to an increase in funding?
It's an interesting question. I have a student who actually may be on the line who's actually looking at the correlation among African Americans between being on the board or senior positions and the actual impact on the grant making, we don't have a lot of firm studies or any rigorous studies or any reliable studies that show if there's a correlation, unfortunately. I mean, at least through my decades in the field, I've certainly seen an impact, but I have to say this is one area where we just don't have the data to show the importance of it. So it's all anecdotal.
Right, absolutely. Deanna, do you have any thoughts on that, given your experience at HIP in terms of, in terms of the theory of change? We've gotten some questions about that too. Sort of theory of change, and one being get more Latinos into the field, another being the collaborative of building collaboratives of models. What's been your perception about what are the most effective strategies for moving the needle?
Leanna, I don't think is on the line.
Or she might have her phone.
I am on the line.
Sorry
about that.
She disappeared. I said maybe she got off.
No, I'm not. Here I am. So to answer your question, Ben, I think I think all of those strategies are important, and they work in concert with each other. Like rice and beans have more protein than rice or beans separately. Clearly, adequate representation of all the groups are going to make for effective philanthropy. And Latinos, like African Americans and Asian Americans and others, and women, have been underrepresented in the field. We have seen some increase, and what often happens is, that there is a tipping point at which, a critical number of people of color, in this case Latinos, are at a foundation, and then you really see, you see changes. But as you well know, we like to say that you don't have to be Hispanic to be hip. We believe that this takes everyone. We have, out of 169 partners of the HIP Collaborative, I would say that perhaps 90% are non-Latinos. So this is, this is a field in which it takes everyone. But certainly including more Latino voices is one of the items that HIP has, over the last almost 30 years, has discussed as a good strategy. The Council on Foundations keeps statistics on foundation staff and trustees. They publish an annual management report that talks about that growth. And if you look at that statistic, and I haven't looked at it in several years, you will not be surprised to find that, the number of staff at foundations, is also below 5%. And trustees are at around 2%. So you have to assume that there are corollaries between those two factors.
And it's interesting because there are some recent statistics that show that in New York City, the representation among program officers of Latinos was like 7%, the lowest of any ethnic group. And yet the Latino population is the largest group in the city. So again, there's a real question as to how are people being hired, why are the decisions being made as they are, and how do we get Latinos into these positions. I have to say that I had written a report some years back that stressed the importance of hiring from within. Whenever nonprofits hire CEO or board members, they look outside the organization. This outdated model that if you hire from the outside, the executive director brings more connections, more networks, a broader perspective. Well, the pipeline of Latinos and the greatest talent is within the organization. And increasingly, if you want diversity, you're going to have to hire from within, because that's where you're going to find the people capable of doing the job. And that lesson hasn't been out there and hasn't been clear. And how many times haven't you been asked, do you know a Latino that could apply to this position of CEO? And you're looking at them, yeah, I know 10 million Latinos. It's just ignorance about how we select leadership. And I think hiring from within has to be said over and over again so the Latinos are not passed over.
Absolutely. And so we have to start wrapping up because we're just almost to the end of time. I will briefly say in response to a few questions about HIP strategy, you know, HIP in particular capacity building, which Leslie raised as a particularly successful strategy. HIP continues to be committed to building the capacity of Latino community-based organization, and we're always looking for partners to do that important work with. And also increasingly we're doing work through focused initiatives. And I think that the wiseness of that strategy is borne out by what Aida was discussing in her findings of, you know, specific program objectives and often specific mandates, you know, donor intent is really what drives much of the foundation sector. So being able to identify ways that a funder like the Gould Foundation can address their specific program priorities and grant-making strategies while also being responsive to Latino communities seems like just a crucial new way for HIP to be doing our work. And we've been doing that in areas like aging and education, partnering with funders to figure out where's that win-win where we can both advance foundation mission and also strengthen Latino communities. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Deanna and thank all of you for being part of this webinar. We will be sending you the slides and a recording of the webinar after this call later in the week, and appreciate, you know, continuing the dialogue with all of you. Deanna?
Thank you. Well, terrific. Thank you, Ben, and thanks once again to all of you who had an interest in this topic, and especially to our speakers. I just want to say what I said at the top of the hour, and that was that this is the beginning of a series of conversations, a series of articles, a series of events that HIP will be doing through 2012, and I just want to invite you to join us for our conference in Los Angeles on April 27th and 28th, where we will have a group of funders focusing on this one issue, and most of all, you know, focusing on the menu of solutions. There is a lot of talent, a lot of intelligence, a lot of promise, and we believe that this is an excellent time to facilitate change in ways that empower our communities. So with that, I want to thank all of you and say hope to see you in Los Angeles.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.